Morning, everyone. My name's Jeff Smith. I'm the technical lead for the agroecology projects under A Lighter Touch. Welcome this morning to our third and the final webinar in this series on agroecological approaches to crop protection. Today we'll carry on with Merf presenting, and today's focus will be on conservation biocontrol, boosting natural populations, and how we've applied this to the perennial fruit cropping systems under A Lighter Touch. Following Merf, we've got a presentation from Matt Carter, who will talk about the application of conservation biocontrol in the A Lighter Touch Gisborne citrus project. And after Matt, we've got Dr Asha Chhagan here, who will then talk about the insect species involved in the project and the data we've been collecting and what could potentially be done with that to enable this project to endure beyond its 2-year life time. So without further ado, I will hand over to Merf, and we'll run through this fairly full program. So let's just get on with it.
Very good. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me get my share going. Okay. Can we see that? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So let me get control. There we go. So a quick outline of what we're doing. Quick touch again on biocontrol, a quick refresher there in agroecology. Then we're going to tell you what the pests are that we were given that wanted to be controlled, the beneficials we found that will help control the pests, the enhancements, and the transformation we have done in this orchard. So what this third webinar is doing is very much bringing those first two webinars together, that conservation biocontrol and the agroecology, because what we are doing is manipulating the orchard ecosystem to enhance the naturally occurring biocontrol organisms using these SNAP plantings. And SNAP is the acronym the late great Professor Steve Ratton came up with for shelter, nectar, alternative prey, and pollen, which are the main conservation biocontrol tools. And to re-emphasize, agroecology is about system redesign. Although this project was based on biocontrol of arthropod pests, we are using an agroecological framework to do that. So we are trying to redesign the whole orchard as part of that process. And so here's our kind of model orchard. Just as well could be a vineyard. We have crops in rows. Underneath we have a herbicide strip, and then we have mown grass. So we're really wanting to transform this. And from an agroecological perspective, it's a really simplified ecosystem. There's basically the crop, the grass, and some soil biology. And there's lots of food for pests because the crop is kind of the only thing there. And so it's really attractive. As we touched on last time, when we're using pesticides for pest control, often this is a downward vicious spiral because we wipe out the beneficial insects that are helping to control the pests. So the pesticides are all we have left to control them. So the pests can actually build up when you use pesticides. The orchard also has very few SNAP provisions for the beneficials, and there's lots of unfilled ecological niches, i.e. space, all that bare soil, that space for weeds, plants, causing significant harm. There's a lack of biodiversity, and that soil under the herbicide strip is certainly not very healthy at all. So the agroecology side is going beyond just pest management. What we want to do is ideally enhance a whole bunch of functions in here. And that's going to lead to increased crop yield and ideally reduce our costs as well. So we've got clovers under the tree for fixing nitrogen. We'll put the grasses, which tend to compete strongly with perennial crops in the alleyway. We'll manage weeds by having competitive plants under the trees, under the vines. That's going to then lead on to improving soil health, biodiversity. If we reduce the amount of mowing we're doing, that's going to save money, and it's going to make the orchard a more interesting place. And so this really is the solution we found. Is kind of, it was interesting because we found a bunch of usual suspects turning up in terms of the beneficial insects and the plants to put in here. So although this was done specifically for citrus, this is something that can be applied across all perennial crop systems. So this is the list of pests we were given to start with. And as you'll see, most of these are actually listed as being specific to citrus. But there's a real diversity. So we've got whitefly, aphids, mites, a moth, thrips, and a beetle, the lemon tree borer. So there's real diversity in here. So this set up a really interesting challenge. So Dr. Morgan Shields, who you can see here, and myself, Morgan was then at Lincoln University. He's now with ECAN, and he was studying, doing a postdoc with the late Steve Ratton. And so we burrowed into the literature, first up to look at the biology and ecology of the pests. If you're using ecological or biological approaches for pest management, you need to understand the biology and ecology of their pests, find their weaknesses and target them. Next thing we looked for is, in the literature, what natural enemies of all those different pests have been identified. And there was a couple of filters we put on this. They need to be present in NZ because we can't do any classical introductory biocontrol, far too expensive and take far too long. So these things need to be here in New Zealand, and some of them can also be commercially purchased. If they're commercially purchased, that also means they're already here. We then said, right, okay, might there be any other controls needed apart from just putting the snap plantings in? So these are the lists of the natural enemies that Morgan and myself identified from the literature. And the thing here is there is a bunch of very usual suspects in here. The Carabid and Staphylinid beetles, the Hoverflies, the Lacewings, the Ladybirds, and the Parasitoids. If you're doing conservation biocontrol, they're right at the top of virtually every list. So the fact that we have these usual suspects in terms of would be beneficial indicates why this would therefore work across all kinds of perennial crops. So let's go and have a look at some of these beneficials. The ladybirds, these were listed as attacking whitefly, aphids, mites, and thrips. And not surprisingly, because ladybirds are highly generalist predators. They are big and they're tough, and they can eat a very large number of pests. We've got the steel blue, the citrus whitefly, ladybirds specifically being listed as eating the Australian citrus whitefly. So let's have a look at a few of these guys. Citrus whitefly ladybird on the left-hand side. This is really quite a small ladybird. You know, the normal ones are kind of 5 or 6 millimeters. This guy's barely a couple of millimeters long. Its larvae is up the top, and these are very distinctive ladybird larvae. They have these big, strong legs, each with their own kind of segment. And then they have this kind of checkerboard pattern on them, and their coloration mimics that of the adults. The very stylish steel blue ladybird over there on the right. And the small ladybird, this is an interesting one. It's an NZ endemic. So virtually in New Zealand, agriculture and horticulture, the whole system is exotic. So all the crops, all the livestock, the pests, the diseases, the weeds, all came basically from Northern Europe. And there is only about a handful of native species that are pests. And so it's interesting that this one's coming in here. And there is suspicion back in the, about 30 years ago, they introduced a spider mite to try and control gorse. And you may remember back in the 90s, you would find gorse bushes completely covered with silken webbing. They suspect that this guy started actually feeding on these introduced mites, and that's why these mites have kind of essentially just about disappeared from the landscape. So kind of a biocontrol in reverse, if you like. So these are some of the kind of more, the ladybirds that most people will be familiar with, you know, big red spotted beasts. The one on the left attacking an aphid there, and you can see the larvae on the right again, the coloration matching the adult, but you've also got that kind of checkerboard arrangement on the back. The harlequin and transverse ladybirds. So we've got a whole chunk of ladybirds on our side. Next up comes predatory mites. So these were listed in the literature as attacking thrips and other mites, so mites versus mites. And for Kelly's thrip, these guys are really important because Kelly's thrip, the pupal and pre-pupal stages are in the soil, not up in the trees. So they're very vulnerable to predation when they're down in the soil if we have a whole bunch of beneficials working at ground level. So a bit of video here showing you Neocelius, which we used to be called Ambicelius.
Neocelis cucumeris is widely used for the biological control of thrips. The nymphs and adults actively search for food. When Neocelis finds its prey, it pierces it with its mouthparts and sucks out the contents. The mites can reproduce while feeding on non-prey food sources such as pollen. This allows them to build up populations before the pests are present. Curious about other beneficials? Check out our YouTube channel for more videos.
So NOPA, they're one of the biggest providers of biological control agents out of the Netherlands, who were the world's leaders, or still are the world's leaders in providing biocontrol. So as they said, they've got a YouTube channel. So if you're interested in seeing more of this, go and check that out. The other important point they made at the end, where he was talking about using things such as pollen. So that's one of the alternative prey / food in SNAP. So that allows these things to build up their populations. So when the pests arrive, there's already a standing army. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce this guy's name, but this is a fairly unpleasant sword-looking sword-dwelling mite that attacks thrip pupae. This is whirligig mite. I studied this for part of my master's thesis. These are voracious predators, and they get their name from the way they run around on leaves on surfaces, kind of whirling around in patterns looking. They're also cannibalistic, so they'll eat smaller versions of themselves. Carabid, what often called ground beetles. These are the tanks of the arthropod world, armed with a pair of jaws of death on the front of the thing. So these are really voracious predators. These will attack stuff as big as earthworms, slugs. They'll also eat weed seeds. So they're really highly generalist predators. These are the Staphylinas. They're a bit smaller, but they're a highly voracious predator. Mostly these guys are operating at ground level, but they will climb up into trees and vines during the night as well, and searching for food up there. Harvestmen, I also worked with for my masters. If you ever look at one of these things under a microscope, they're very, very cool looking things. They're like a tank on stilts. So the Harvestmen and spiders, they're not listed for any particular pest that we were given. However, they're widely known as being really effective generalist predators. And indeed, if you think kind of springtime, you'll often look out across a grass field and it's just covered in spiders' webs. So there can be really high populations of these things if you provide the right environment for them. Hoverflies, these are very stylish as adults. They look like wasps and bees, and that's mimicry to protect them from predators. Key distinguishing feature is the abdomen is quite flat, whereas the abdomen on a wasp is quite fat, and they hover, and they'll be feeding on flowers and stuff, which wasps generally don't do. Again, not listed for any particular pest, but in conservation biocontrol, these are a real key go-to predator. And it's the larval stages that are the predators. So the adults principally feed on nectar and pollen in the snap. And so the larvae will attack a wide range of stuff, including the likes of whitefly and aphid. And so this is a hoverfly larvae. They are flies. So this is a maggot. So the adult is very pretty. The larvae, not quite so. It's kind of semi-transparent and wriggles around like fly larvae do. And you can see the size difference here between aphids. These things can eat 50, hundreds aphids a day. They can really get stuck in to pests. And especially so if you've got large numbers of these, you have a very good army on your side. Pirate bugs, these were listed for attracting aphids, thrips, and they are, again, general voracious predators that will attack a wide range of things. Aureus is commercially available. There are other species out here. Very distinctive wing covers on these, and this great stiletto-like mouth parts that it uses for piercing and feeding on its prey. Lacewings, very common biocontrol agent again, listed as attacking whitefly and thrips, but the larvae are particularly, as I'll show you in a second, really ghastly looking things that attack just about anything they can get their mouth parts on. The adults feed on pollen and nectar, but they will also eat a small soft arthropods as well. The Tasmanian is commercially available, but with the right environment, these things are just super abundant. So this is what the adult looks like. As the name implies, it has these big lacy wings. The long antennae are also a bit of a giveaway as well. And this is what larvae looks like. So kind of, you know, truly alien kind of film horror story kind of organisms here. Parasitoids, these are parasitic wasps. So they are wasps like the kind of German wasp that gives us a load of trouble in terms in autumn and stuff, coming in and raiding our apples and fruit and stuff on the trees. But they don't sting like the other wasps. They use their sting to lay their eggs. And this is the one thing we found that was listed for attacking lemon tree borer. So lemon tree borer is one of the other few native species that are pests, but its name's a bit of a misnomer because it doesn't just attack lemon trees, it attacks about 200 native species. So it's ubiquitous in the environment where there's a lot of natives. The other thing with parasitoids is typically one parasitoid species will only attack one pest species or a few very closely related. For example, they might attack a few different species of aphids. What there is, however, is lots and lots of different parasitoid species. Indeed, the wasps as a whole is one of the largest taxonomic groups there are. And there's not many in the kind of the German wasp or the hornet family. They're virtually all these parasitic wasps as well. So we need lots of different species of parasitoids. And each of those often have different SNAP requirements. Steve Ratton and his students would often find that a parasitoid they were working with really liked flower A, and then they'll get a very closely related parasitoid and it didn't like flower A at all. It did really badly on it and it needed flower B. So a key thing here with introducing this large amount of diversity is to try and make sure there are some SNAP plants here that all kinds of different parasitoids will be able to benefit from.
Aphidius has very effective searching behavior. Once the female has made contact with its host, she stabs her ovipositor into the aphid to deposit an egg.
So one of the comments there was they've got good searching behavior. So what tends to happen if you've got a beneficial that's highly specialist on one or a very small number of species of pests, they need to be able to find those pests when they're at low numbers so they can detect them through things such as smell and vibrations. Whereas the more generalist predators, the lacewings and hoverflies and stuff, tend to more kind of just charge around just looking for anything. And so here you can see this picture here as well. It's not just small stuff that parasitoids will attack. This much larger parasitoid here is clearly facing off with this caterpillar because it attacks this caterpillar. And certainly for the bigger pests as well, they'll fight back. There's some really great videos out there of parasitoids and their prey fighting each other. Citrus whitefly predator, this is endemic to New Zealand and Australia, and it specializes on citrus whitefly. And this was one of the examples where there's virtually no literature, literally less than a handful of research papers that we could find on this. And from one of the original papers, they said that when it was kept in confinement with the citrus whitefly, it really devoured the eggs and juveniles. But when it was offered glasshouse whitefly, it really didn't like them at all. So it really is highly specialized. So the good news is there's a whole pile of beneficial insects out there, arthropods, that both attack our specific pests and that are generalist predators. So for me, there's huge potential out there for pest management when we change the ecosystem. So Morgan and myself, having identified these beneficial insects, we went back into the literature to see which plants were listed as providing SNAP for these beneficials. And then again, we had more filtering. So it's no use if these things aren't present in Z. There's no use if they're going to be a pain in the backside and noxious. We want them to be easily available and cheap. They need to look after themselves and they need to fit into an orchard system. So all the sunflowers, the regen guys, not a very practical thing. All the sunflowers and big tall stuff the regen guys go, it's clearly not going to work in an orchard. So we are designing stuff from the get-go here that was going to be practical in real-world orchards, so people can get in there and that they're not going to compete with the trees, and ideally they are going to boost the trees. So on that basis, for most perennial crops, you will want to avoid grasses under trees because grasses have fibrous, shallow root systems which are really competitive with perennial crops. Instead, what we want to put under the trees are mostly clovers. This is because clovers have got the weakest root systems because they can fix their own nitrogen, so they don't compete with other plants for it. Many of them are tap-rooted, which means they occupy a different soil volume to the shallow feeder roots of perennial crops. And the nitrogen they fix can be directly transferred to the trees via mycorrhiza. Indeed, we did find one paper where they had found exactly that, where they were using lemon seedlings. In the alleyways, we want to put a highly diverse past mixture because the grasses are not going to be competing strongly with the crop roots if they're in the alleyway. We need legumes in there as well for fixing nitrogen and snap. Grasses are really good, particularly in their base, for providing shelter. And while there's no nectar, they're good at providing pollen and also for hosting alternative prey, because grasses completely different from the monocots are completely different from the dicots, and they don't share many pests. So if you've got aphids on grasses, they're unlikely to be going onto the crop. We also want some flowering species in there for providing the nectar and pollen in snap. And ideally what we want is stuff that's not going to take a lot of maintenance. So we're mostly focused on putting perennial plants into this pasture. Typically, we'd kind of leave it there as a nice setup for a system, but because this is a research and demonstration project, we thought we'd push the boat out and put some annuals into the system. And that's partly because of what I call Steve Ratton's Holy Trinity. So buckwheat, alyssum, and phacelia, Steve Ratton and his students found that invariably when they were doing a conservation biocontrol project, one of these came up top trumps. So kind of it would be good to have buckwheat and phacelia as annuals in this project. So the original concept was that we would strip till these in between the pasture and the living mulch under the trees. And because these are annuals, they're going to grow, flower, go to seed and die. We need to sequentially drill them in over a period of 2 or 3 weeks between batches, so we have strips in flower at all times. So this is what the literature search turned up, a range of perennials, annuals, and stuff that kind of falls into both. The Asteraceae over there on the both category is the sunflower family, the old Compositae. So we're going to look at a whole load more of these. So these are all available as well online, so you don't need to write everything down here. So those were listed as boosting beneficials in the report, but I also added in a bunch of other stuff based on other conservation biocontrol research and also trying to maximize biodiversity without kind of getting a little bit crazy. So this is what we've put under the intro. We've got a handful of clovers and alyssum and plantain, because I thought they would kind of fit structurally and morphologically quite well amongst the clovers. In the alleyway, where we've got this mixed pasture on the right-hand side, you can see we've got 7 different grasses here, so a diversity of grasses. Then we've got some, on the left, we've got some legumes, dandelion and plantain. Dandelion's got really high quality nectar. You'll often see butterflies feeding on it. We also put the plantain in there as well, some yarrow, and marigolds I kind of put in partly because they're just going to look really visually stunning in these mixtures. And then this is the mixture we're putting in the annual strip. Rycorn down the bottom was really intrigued myself and Morgan, because many papers listed Rycorn as being really good for providing snap. So they're not quite sure what's going on there, but that's the annual strip list. So this is what the transformation looks like. We start with a typical orchard or vineyard, and we start putting these legumes and the alyssum under the trees or the vines. Then stage 2, the mown grass strip is replaced by this diverse pasture mixture that we've just listed and shown you already. So that goes in here. And then we put these annual strip between the two. So this is the list I've shown you already. Got some nice crimson clover there in the background. And that goes in between the two. Now, clearly this has been photoshopped. So as Matt will cover off, we've had a bit of problems with some establishment, but this is the game plan. So we don't have any actual photos of the implementation yet to show you. So that's what the transformation looks like. So this is really something quite different. So in terms of actually getting this into the orchard, the idea with the grass strip is either we blow it out with some herbicides or cultivate it up and then just drill the pasture mixture in. For the herbicide strip under the crop, this tends to be more challenging, particularly if that herbicide strip has been around for quite a while, because the soil conditions are quite hard, and there's no machinery kind of specifically designed for drilling under a perennial crop like that. So hydroseeding might be an option, although it tends to be quite expensive. There is also now a high pressure water weeder in the country being tested. And that tends to really fluff the soil up. So we may be able to look at something like that as a way of actually loosening the soil up and allowing us to get some seeds into the ground. In terms of the maintenance, the key thing, particularly for the pasture, is the species in the pasture mixture has to flower to provide snap. So we don't want to mow this regularly, and if you do, in fact, you'll kill it off. But one comment we've had from growers is that don't let these things seed too much, because otherwise they can be really quite attracted to rodents. So citrus flower moth, this is a particularly challenging pest because the caterpillars, once the eggs hatch, quickly bore into the flower, so they're protected. So there's potential that we may need to use pheromone mating disruption or apply the likes a biopesticide like BT at the point that these caterpillars are going to be hatching. Ants are well known for farming sap-sucking insects for their honeydew, but they also defend them against predators. And here we can see on just towards the left of the middle of the screen, there's a little parasitoid wasp. The ant has found it, it's feeling and smelling it with its antenna, and then it's gone, yep, it's a pest, and it's killing it. And it's not just even small large, insects either.
Well-armored insects like the ladybird are no match for them.
So the ants will keep off, even big stuff as well. So if they prove to be a problem, we will be looking at controlling ants, because certainly in other projects they've shown by controlling ants, you're releasing the pests from their bodyguards, and the beneficials can then come in and kill them. So thank you very much. This is a photo of a second orchard that we've been working with, and they decided to put the annuals in as a single strip. And this is Matt here. So I will now hand you over to Matt. Thank you very much indeed.
Great, thanks, Merf. Just before we kick off with Matt, I just put a note in the chat function there. If there's any questions, if you can type them into the chat function, we can stop between presentations to answer any of those questions, or at the end of the webinar. Just one other thing I'd like to add too, just Merf talking about the establishment of the biodiversity in the project. There is a resource available on the Untitled Chapter website that Sally Anderson has put together for us, just talking through the practicalities of doing that, of establishing the biodiverse species, and a list of those species that Merf talked about as well. So that's all available on the Untitled Chapter website. Thanks, and over to you, Matt.
Oh, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm Matt Carter, part of Cirtus New Zealand, the R&D portfolio lead, and helping on the Light Touch project here. So I'm just going to run through what we've done in Gisborne and show you the progress so far. Next one. There we go. So we've got the aim of the project here: reducing or eliminating pesticide usage, increasing the BCAs, biocontrol agents, as Merf's been talking about, as well as the plant diversity, by planting that wide range of plants that Merf's listed already. And the big thing is that so it's in a practical way, so that growers can replicate this across the country and in a wide variety of crops. So quite a few people
just lean into your mic a bit more, Matt.
Oh, sorry. Quite a few people involved. Obviously, Jeff at Lighter Touch leading this. Cirtus New Zealand and the citrus growers agreeing to be the trial hosts, and then a whole range of all of the fruit categories that are also involved in a lighter touch. So summer fruit, passion fruit, kiwi fruit, etc. All taking an interest in this. So we've got two trial blocks in Gisborne. The first one is called Greymark Vineyard, run by Sam Teachin, and we're using some Aphora mandarins for that trial block. The picture there you can see in the background is some work that he'd done on his own prior to this. So he put in a new block of lemons, and using the same people that have supplied our seed, they supplied a mix there. You can see the list of things to provide some organic matter, fix some nitrogen, and provide shelter for the new lemon trees. So Sam was fairly invested in cover cropping from the start. The other block is IKO Orchard run by Tamjex Blake. We're using a block of Washington or parent navel oranges for the trial. The whole orchard is 15 hectares, which is fairly large for a citrus orchard. And they've got a mix of mid and late season oranges and some mandarins. They've also got a large high country station running sheep and beef. And they've recently fenced off and split up the whole orchard so that they can run sheep through the orchard. They do that in a highly controlled manner, so they'll put a whole mob of lambs in there, generally up to 400 of them, and run them through there for 24 hours and take them out. The aim being that they can chew down the grass and the vegetation without touching the trees. And you know, this through the rest of the block has just about eliminated their herbicide use as well. So this is what we're planting. Merf went through these as well before, but there's a picture of it actually growing there. So in the interrow between the where the tractors run, there's principally grasses, but there's also some clovers, lupus and plantain, etc. in there, plus a wide variety of grass, so cocksfoot, ryegrass, some timothy, smooth meadowgrass, some fescue, and some chicory in there. That just gives us that level of diversity in the pollen supply. Got some legumes in there to put a bit of nitrogen back into that ground as well. And we're hoping for some better drainage long term as some of those large tap rooting plants get established. So this is the down the road, down the annual flower strips. This is the IKO block, and we ended up putting the strips down the middle in this block, as Merf alluded to earlier. We did that every 5th row, I believe, and they've got sequential sowings there to just keep the beneficials coming in through the season. So, and you can see it flowering there, buckwheat, some coriander, crimson clover, phacelia and ryecorn. Dill was in the original mix, but we had a bit more advice that that can become quite a weed problem and has done down in the South Island. So we thought we'd rather leave that out than start causing ourselves problems. Sorry. And then under the trees, a little bit there you can see on your screen, we putting this under there to smother the weeds, fix some nitrogen with some tree health. We get in citrus, we get brown rot disease, which is a phytophthora, but it affects the fruit. So obviously, being a phytophthora, lives in the soil. If we get high levels of rainfall or heavy rain, it can splash out and up onto the fruit, and it can affect the entire tree if it's late to get too bad. So herbicide strips are not our friend in that situation. So having some ground cover under the trees is great. So again, we've got those clovers in there. and Similicum and plantain. We did end up leaving the red clover out. We learned that it could get anything up to knee height in good growing conditions, and considering we've still got to go through and plant and prune these trees using people, we didn't think they'd be too keen on trying to push through knee-high red clover. So just some pictures here of where our establishment was relatively good. Top left picture there is some of the buckwheat mix. To the right next to it there, we've got some of the grass, and down the middle of the rows, and then just some of the species there, the crimson clovers and buckwheats as they began flowering. For the sites, we've got our 50 by 50 metre trial areas, which is 1/4 of a hectare. Both of the blocks that we're using are a hectare, so we've got a large buffer zone around them. We are actually planting the entire hectare block, and then doing our monitoring, etc., within the 50 by 50 area, so there's plenty of buffer around them. And we picked the two particular blocks because of the owners and their philosophies, but also because of the varieties they've got in there. The Aphora mandarin and the navel orange, less likely to require a critical insecticide, which means that if we monitor and find some pest species, we can just hold off a little bit longer without affecting the crop before we either have to put something on or try and allow those BCAs to take effect. Lemons, for example, with the Kelly's citrus thrip, that needs to be controlled pretty rapidly because of export market quality. So the Kelly's thrip puts a little racetrack mark around the top of the lemon and knocks it out of contention for export. So we didn't want to be relying on BCAs in the first instance for that crop. So from the practicality side, this is how we're doing it. We were spraying off and mowing down what was currently there. We've done some cultivation where it's needed to get that good seed soil contact. And for the interrow and the annual flower strips, we were using this Duncan vineyard cedar owned by a local contractor, 1.8 meters wide. It just went straight in the ground. It was pretty good for that. The other option, which works just as well, is just a fertilizer spreader, a Vicon or similar, to spread the seed down the rows and then just chain harrow it in or roll it in. And we may be doing a bit of that in the spring, just to top up what we've already done, as you'll see in a little bit. Under the tree, as Merf said, it's not the easiest place to try and plant something, so we used the little manual hand feeders, as you can see just in the bottom right photo there. One of our guys going along spreading that seed under the trees. There's just a few pictures there of what we were doing and how it looked as we did it. So that orchard is the Aphora mandarins. Under the trees, as I said, quite difficult. So we thought of a few things. Merf talked about hydro seeding and the like. We also thought about using compost, so mixing the seed mix into compost and then spreading that under the trees. Just given where we are, there was no one able to do that, and so we didn't. We ended up spreading that seed and then putting a band of compost over the top. Unfortunately, as many of you probably know, you need a lot of compost to make a difference. And although we put the equivalent of 50 tonnes a hectare on, 20 tonnes a hectare, it probably needed more like 50 to be able to get a decent layer over the seed under those trees. However, if we can get that right, it does give us that seed soil contact, bit of moisture retention, and then the general benefits of compost by adding organic matter, etc. For monitoring the crops, we are using our citrus crop monitors. So they're provided by First Fresh, and we are adding, they're going into the block every 2 weeks. They're recording the levels of beneficial and pest species in accordance with the IPM. So they're recording all of that. They're looking at 10 trees and 5 sites on each tree to a total of 50 sites. Any IPM thresholds will then inform agrochemical applications, which we actually haven't had to do in either block. Plant and Food are collating and analysing that data, and Asha will be on shortly to go through some of that. Oh. Sorry. As part of the toolkit and ongoing extension, we've got some photography going on in there. Looking at monthly photos with the trial and the control blocks being photographed. So over time, you'll be able to see the effects of that. And I'll just sort of quickly run through what's happened so far. So we planned in September 2021 to plant these following a workshop. But you probably remember last August, we had a bit of a lockdown. Everything got moved back to October, and then we had a couple of huge rain events in Gisborne. We finally got everything planted in mid-November, and then it went dry. So mid-November is a good couple of months later than we really wanted to do it. So we got very patchy establishment, as you can see there. And in some cases, we got some of the weeds, some summer grass especially, was out competing. So we thought in autumn we would mow all that down, spray it off again, and have another go. So we have done that. Half of the IKO block looked pretty good, so we've left that in as a comparison, and we aim to replant the flower strips in late August or early September, so in the next couple of months, so that as they're flowering, it coincides with the pest species coming in, which is sort of late October and through November. We finally got it in on the 27th of April, and it's looking a bit patchy, which is why I said that we may look at just spinning some more on the top in the spring. So we'll just see how that looks in another month or so. And again, just the under tree sowing, we've mentioned most of this. We're going to have another go at that in September as well, in better conditions, and see if we can get some better establishment going there too. So extension and promotion, you can see at the top there, the project made it to the front page of the Orchardist, and there was a really good article on that for both Tam and Sam's blocks. That was a couple of months ago, back in May. Jeff's done some interviews on the radio, lots of things in local papers. Obviously, we're on the third of the webinars with Merf. Doing presentations to various sector groups. So we've had presentations to Summerfruit in Hawke's Bay and Central Otago, who are very interested in taking up some of this and putting it in their crops. And the establishment toolkit has been written and published. Sally Anderson's written that. So it's basically a how-to guide for any growers that want to take part in it. And that's it. And there's the report there that Merf and Morgan did. I think that's available to anyone that wants to go through all that initial stages of it. And that's me.
Okay, so I'll pick it up from there. Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Asha Chhagan. I'm an entomologist at Plant Food Research, and I'm based in Auckland. So yeah, today I'll be presenting the preliminary results of the trial work. So I thought I'd just start by presenting a bit of an overview in terms of what we observed in the citrus trees in the orchards. So which pests and beneficial species were we observing? Okay, so some of the most commonly observed pest species we were noticing in both the agroecology, so the treated blocks with the beneficial plantings, and also the control blocks were citrus whitefly. There was also a variety of scale insects, including this cottony cushion scale, and also black citrus aphid and mealybug. Some of the other pests we also observed were passion vine hopper and thrips. Okay, so how about the good guys? What were we seeing in terms of the beneficial species? Again, both in the agroecology blocks and the control blocks, we came across steel blue ladybird and also citrus whitefly ladybird. So as Merf mentioned, both the adults and the larvae are known to eat a real wide variety of pest species, including aphids, mites, psyllids, scale insects, and whitefly. So another commonly observed generalist predator we came across was the whirligig mite, this one here. Merf showed you quite a cool video of that one crawling all over that leaf. Also another generalist predator, so feeding on a variety of insects, including aphids and pest mites. Okay, and finally we have here the lacewing larva, and also here we have an adult. Again, very generalist, feeding on things like aphids, mealybugs, psyllids, and whitefly. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to focus on what we were seeing at site 1. So this was the mandarin block at Braymark. Okay, so here we have the proportion of the 10 trees that were assessed at site 1, so in the mandarins, with a particular pest species. So we've got the black citrus aphid, mealybug, and cottony cushion scale at each of the assessment dates. So assessment date down here, proportion of trees here, 0 represents none of the trees having the particular pest species, and 1 represents 100% of the trees having that particular pest species. If we look at the 2 lines here, so the green is the agroecology block, and the purple is the untreated block. So I'll start here on the left, looking at black citrus aphid. You can see that the proportion of trees with this particular pest increased throughout the season, had a bit of a peak here. But if you could compare both the agroecology and control, there was no real difference happening there. Okay, so onto mealybug. You can see it kind of fluctuated throughout the season, and no real difference again between the 2 blocks. Cottony cushion scale, relatively low proportion of trees with this particular pest, sitting kind of below that 25% mark, and again, kind of similar patterns happening between the agroecology and control blocks. Okay, so what was happening in terms of the beneficial species in the mandarins? So again, we've got the data along here, the proportion of trees with the particular beneficial species. The green is the agroecology block, and the purple is the control block. So I'll start here on the left again. So citrus whitefly ladybird had a bit of fluctuation throughout the season, and no real difference between the agroecology and control block. Okay, so steel blue ladybird definitely had a high proportion of trees with steel blue ladybird at the beginning of the year, and this kind of fell away in both blocks towards the end there. And whirligig mites, so this reached around 25% of trees with this particular beneficial in late summer, autumn, but again, similar story, agroecology and control block had similar similar presence. Okay, so I'm just going to focus in a little bit more now. So what I was presenting was the proportion of trees with particular pests or beneficials. Now we're going to delve in a little bit deeper and look at the proportion of canopy sites. So if you remember, as Matt explained, we had 10 trees per block that were assessed, and within each tree we were looking at 5 particular canopy sites. So going around the tree in 5 areas and looking at the presence of those particular species. So that gives us our 50 canopy sites. So again, we've got the date along the bottom here, and this time we've got the proportion of canopy sites along the side. And if we look at our focusing on these 3 particular pest species again, so we've got black citrus aphid, mealybug, and cottony cushion scale. The proportion of canopy sites with each particular pest generally remained quite low, so sitting below that 25% mark. And again, no real difference between the agroecology and control blocks. And looking at our beneficial species and the proportion proportion of canopy sites with these particular species, we've got our citrus whitefly ladybird, steel blue ladybird, and whirligig mite again. And if we look across here, we can see that those beneficials are generally sitting below 25% over time. You can see a little bit of a higher number of sites with steel blue ladybird actually in the control, but no significant difference really happening there. Okay, so that was site 1. Now we're just going to focus in on site 2. So this, if you remember, was the orange block. And we've just focused in on the canopy sites here. So this is the presence of pest species across the 50 canopy sites. So we only have data here for the agroecology block. We didn't collect any control data until April, so we'll just focus on this. So again, we've got the black citrus aphid, the mealybug, and cottony cushion scale. As you can see, similar to site 1, got our pest levels sort of sitting below that 25% mark most of the time. And in terms of beneficial species at site 2, also sitting reasonably low here. We've got steel blue ladybird, similar to site 1, where we had higher numbers at the beginning and it kind of dropped off throughout the season. So I guess knowing that there was better establishment of the beneficial plantings at site 2 with the oranges, did this translate into any differences in terms of the presence of pests and beneficial species? I guess the simple answer here is no at this point. I have here just a bit of a comparison between site 1 and 2. So top here is the pest species at site 1. Here we have the pest species at site 2. So if we have a little bit of a comparison in terms of the green line, so the agroecology between site 1 and 2, if we look, for example, at black citrus aphid, you can see that the proportion of sites with black citrus aphid was low to begin with, have a little bit of a peak here and it kind of falls away. We're seeing a similar thing happening here at site 2. Low numbers of cottony cushion scale, low number of sites with cottony cushion scale at both sites, and passion vine hopper, similar kind of pattern happening here. And with mealybug, similar pattern again with a bit of a fluctuation in numbers. Okay, so this is the beneficial species, a comparison between site 1 and 2. Again, a bit of a similar pattern happening between site 1 and 2. So if I just pull out, for example, steel blue ladybird, you can see again that we had high number of sites with this particular beneficial, sort of that late January, February period at both site 1 and 2, and then it kind of fell away at both sites. Okay, so just a little bit of a summary of our prelim results. So several beneficial insects were observed in both the agroecology, so the treated blocks with the beneficial plantings and the controlled blocks. There was no real difference in the proportion of trees or canopy sites with a particular pest or beneficial species between the control and treated areas. But I'd just like to remind everyone that this is, it's only been 6 months, so it's quite a short time frame to see any meaningful differences at this point in time. And going forward, we'll be continuing our monitoring next season with some potential adjustments to assessments. And I think that is me. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Asha. And again, thanks for all the effort that you've put in behind the scenes as well, collating the data and trying to make something meaningful out of it for us. So keen to take on board your suggestions on how we can keep this project going beyond its 2-year life frame. So thanks very much. Just looking at the questions in the chat. Matt's answered the one about borage, wasn't on the original list. Did you have any comments on borage as a snap species, Merf?
Yeah, I'm just trying to rack my brains for it. I mean, it certainly didn't come up in our literature research, and I'm not quite sure how good, how useful it is as a snap type plant. I think it's quite good in terms of nectar. I'm not quite so sure in terms of pollen. It is an annual species though, and we were tending to focus in on the perennial species there. And in terms of the mowing, I mean, to me, mow as little as possible, except when the pasture is going to be in the way, you know, it's a problem with workers in the orchard or something like that. But ideally you want to leave it to get as long as possible in flower. The other time you'll be mowing is if there's a large amount of seed starting to be produced and curtailing seed production. And certainly with the annuals, if you're planting the annuals as a whole strip through the mid-row and replacing pasture, it's also possible to strategically mow. So as they start flowering, if you strategically mow some take the top third off, that'll reset some of it, and then it'll start flowering again later. So it is possible to strategically manage and continue the annuals to flower for a longer period by strategically mowing them.
Cool, thank you. I'll probably just follow up on the monitoring topic as well. There is the part 2 of the toolkit that Sally's put together is actually focused on monitoring, how to go about it. So again, a bit of a how-to, a bit like the establishment guide, how to monitor in a perennial fruit system. So that will be on the website this week as well. That's part 2. And then part 3, the final part of that is the management of all this, bringing it together and utilising the information that you generate from the monitoring data, etc. as well. So that's still to come. If there's no more questions, yes, that'll be it for today, and
Yep.
The webinar will be posted on the Lighter Touch website. So if you would like to refer back to any particular topics, it will be there for you. Okay, so thanks again, Merf. Always
Thanks all.
a pleasure listening to your presentations, and Matt and Asha too for your input today. That's fantastic.
Very good. All the
Thank
best.
you.